want it back. They took our oil rights. We had a lot of oil there. As you know, they threw our companies out, and we want it back.
Because we want to surround ourselves with good neighbors. We want to surround ourselves with stability. We want to surround ourselves with energy. We have tremendous energy in that country. It's very important that we protect it. We need that for ourselves. We need that for the world. And we want to make sure we can protect it.
You know, we've seen how our adversaries all over the world are exploiting and extracting resources from Africa, from every other continent. They're not going to do it in the Western Hemisphere. Yeah. They're not. That is not going to happen under President Trump. Read our national security strategy. He is serious about it, and he's going to do something about it.
It's about peace on Earth.
How is it peace on Earth?
Peace on Earth. We got to have peace. It's our hemisphere. The Monroe Doctrine was very important when it was done, and other presidents, a lot of them, they lost sight of it. I didn't lose sight. But it really is, it's peace on Earth, peace on Earth.
Venezuela took our oil rights. And we want it back. That's not democracy language. That's not human rights language. That's ownership language, entitlement spoken in plain English. Now listen to the doctrine that makes entitlement sound respectable. This is our hemisphere. This is where we live. We will not allow adversaries here. That single phrase turns Latin America into a managed zone, and turns other countries' alliances into intrusions. It's the adversary trap. Label your rivals as outsiders, frame your control as security, and recast a sovereign nation's independence as a threat. And once you see that script, Venezuela stops being a one-off crisis. It becomes a case study in how power rewrites the map, rewrites the rules, and rewrites the story. This is Liberation Lens. And in this episode, we're going to expose the engine behind the headlines. How a 200-year-old sphere of influence mindset still shapes policy today. How the word adversary launders coercion into legitimacy, and why the Global South should treat this as a warning, because when power wants your resources or your alignment, your sovereignty becomes conditional. Here's the core idea. In an empire-shaped world, control rarely introduces itself as control. It introduces itself as security. When Washington says security in the Western Hemisphere, it doesn't only mean missiles. It means alignment. It means who builds your ports, who finances your infrastructure, who ensures your shipping, who trains your security forces, who buys your commodities, who processes your payments. In other words, security becomes control over options. That's why we will not allow matters so much. We will not allow is not a diplomatic phrase. It's a managerial phrase. It implies authority over someone else's choices. And this worldview didn't appear yesterday. It has deep roots. In 1823, the Monroe Doctrine declared the Americas off-limits to European empires. In its original form, it was framed as a defensive warning. Keep colonizers out. But doctrines evolve. They expand. What begins as Europe stay out becomes we decide what happens here. Then comes the part people forget. The doctrine didn't die. It modernized. The enemies changed. The messaging changed. The tools changed. But the permission structure stayed intact. The hemisphere is treated as an American-managed space. Now zoom in on the word that makes this all work, adversary. It doesn't just describe a competitor. It casts them as an intruder, someone who doesn't belong. It turns a sovereign partnership into infiltration. It turns trade into a security threat. It turns diplomacy into defiance. And once that framing sticks, coercion becomes easy to sell. If others are intruding, Washington is protecting. If a country chooses alternatives, it's destabilizing. If the US imposes pressure, it's restoring order. That is narrative laundering, turning influence into protection. Here's the hypocrisy in one breath. When Russia claims a sphere in Eastern Europe, Washington calls it aggression. When China claims a sphere around Taiwan, Washington calls it coercion. But Washington claims a sphere in the Americas, our hemisphere, and calls it security. Same logic. Different branding. That's not a rules-based order. That's a power-based order, with rules used as speeches, not restraints. Now let's talk about the part the headlines often avoid, the material engine under the story. We want it back. Back implies ownership. Back implies entitlement. Back implies Venezuela's resources are treated like a lost possession rather than a sovereign asset. That language matters because it reveals what polite diplomacy often hides. In sphere thinking, some resources in some places are treated as historically ours, even if they sit inside someone else's borders. This is why Venezuela becomes a pressure target. Because Venezuela combines three things that trigger maximum enforcement in a sphere of influence mindset: strategic resources, strategic geography, and strategic refusal. So when Venezuela deepens ties with Russia, accepts Chinese financing, and works with Iran under pressure and sanctions, Washington doesn't interpret it as a sovereign state choosing partners to survive and develop. It interprets it as defiance inside a claimed sphere. Now here's the machine, the mechanism that turns doctrine into outcomes. This is the part most mainstream coverage never explains, because it's easier to cover events than systems. First, delegitimize. You undermine the government's status, call it fraudulent, criminal, illegitimate, a regime. Second, isolate. You pressure allies, institutions, and regional bodies to treat the target as abnormal. Third, squeeze. You restrict financing, block trade channels, punish companies, threaten secondary sanctions, freeze assets. Fourth, incubate crisis. The economy struggles, shortages deepen, currency instability rises, public anger grows. Fifth, use the suffering as proof. The hardship, often intensified by coercion, is presented as evidence the government must be replaced. Sixth, offer a solution. Recognition games, transitional authorities, liberation narratives, always framed as rescue. This is how coercion manufactures the conditions that justify coercion. And here's the paradox. The pressure helps produce the crisis, and then the crisis is used to explain why pressure was necessary. Now bring in Iran, because Iran is the proof that this isn't only hemispheric. It's a global method. Iran shows the coercion stack in full view. Sanctions that tighten economic pain, pressure that restricts normal trade, and political messaging that pushes the blame entirely inward, as if external squeezing is not part of the design. Then comes the threat layer. When unrest flares, the rhetoric shifts into "we support the people," and warnings appear about consequences if the government uses force. In practice, this turns human rights language into another pressure lever. So Iran becomes a case study in how external power tries to reshape internal politics, not always with invasion, but with economic strangulation, diplomatic isolation, and the constant suggestion that regime survival depends on compliance. In other words, sanctions aren't just punishment. They are instruments of political engineering. Now pause and absorb what this means. If Washington reserves the right to define who is acceptable in its hemisphere, while intervening rhetorically and strategically in other regions under the banner of rules, then the global order isn't really rules-based. It's power-based, with rules used as arguments, not restraints. And this is why the sphere of influence mindset is dangerous to the world, not just to Latin America. Because the moment one superpower normalizes spheres, every other power learns the lesson. Russia will say, our near abroad. China will say, our seas and our reunification. Others will say, our region, our responsibility. And then the UN principle of equal sovereignty becomes a slogan, not a shield. This is how multilateral order breaks, not with a single collapse, but with repeated exceptions carved out by the powerful. Now the Global South lesson, because Liberation Lens doesn't stop at analysis. We translate what it means for the viewer. If you're watching from Africa, South Asia, the Middle East, the Caribbean, this is not distant history. It's a mirror. The mechanism is the same wherever power and resources intersect. First, your alliances are judged. Then your partners are labeled adversaries. Then your independence is framed as instability. Then pressure arrives, financial, diplomatic, economic, often long before anything military. Sovereignty becomes conditional. A lease, not a right. Renewable only as long as your choices don't disrupt the hierarchy. And once you see that, the two sentences that opened this video become impossible to hear innocently. We want it back. This is our hemisphere. That is entitlement wrapped in doctrine. Resources wrapped in security. Hierarchy wrapped in order. So the real question isn't whether Venezuela's government is perfect. The real question is whether any external power has the right to treat a region like property and treat sovereign choices as crimes. Because if a hemisphere can be claimed, and resources can be spoken of as ours, then the future is not ruled by law. It's ruled by permission. And permission is never freedom. Drop a comment and tell us where you see this sphere language in your region. What words are used to justify pressure, security, stability, terror, adversaries, rules-based order? Because the first step out of dependency is recognizing the language of control. At Liberation Lens, we don't just report the news. We translate the script of power. If this breakdown sharpened your perspective, subscribe, share, and stay with us, because doctrines don't disappear. They evolve. And they're being updated in real time. This is Liberation Lens. And in a world of curated language, perspective has never mattered more.